Okay, in chapter 13, we're going to talk about our corrections systems, um, specifically our prisons and our jails. Um, Through this lecture, we're going to talk about the components of the correction system. We'll talk about some of the early history of penal institutions, the Quaker Revolution, the New York and Pennsylvania models that became early examples for other states to follow. We'll talk a little bit about penal reform, and then we're going to dive into county jails and their systems, new generation jails, and then we'll talk about prisons at the federal and the state level, as well as trends. When we talk about the components of a correction system, there's a distinctive difference between jails and prisons. So, county jails only hold pretrial detainees, people who've been convicted of misdemeanors, and in some cases, some low level felonies. Now, there's always intricacies to this. People who've been uh, placed on probation or parole and have had that probation violated will sometimes spend a short period of time in a county jail instead of going to the prison. But for the most part, when you think of county jails, think of pretrial and misdemeanors. And when you think of prisons, think of those convicted felons um, who have been given a longer sentence. Incarceration is not new, has been around for centuries, but long term incarceration was not the norm until about the 19th century. The first penal institutions, as we understand them, were actually created in 10th century England and then formalized by the king in the 12th century, who empowered shire reeves to build holding centers within their own counties for pretrial detainees. Workhouses were created a couple hundred years later, mostly for minor offenses. The critiques related to those were that living conditions were beyond deplorable and that surviving being incarcerated in one of these places was usually a miracle. When people went in there, they were maybe only supposed to be held before trial or forced to do some kind of work, but often they didn't survive it. Interestingly enough, in England, the process, as we talked before, was to ship convicts out to send them to the United States or to Australia. And after the American Revolution, they couldn't keep up with the number of people who needed to be exiled to Australia, and they certainly couldn't bring them to the United States anymore. So they used hulks or abandoned ships as prisons in England shortly after that. And that actually lasted until about 1858. Back here in the United States, um, our origin point for prison systems here in the United States is typically traced to William Penn, who formed or helped form the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. We had prison systems, they weren't formalized, they were terrible, people were mistreated. This was a group that sought to improve the living conditions for those that were in prison. The Quaker Revolution had a pretty enormous impact, mostly because of their political influence within the state legislature. Big pieces of corrections practices that we see today that still exist from the Quaker Revolution are the concept of solitary confinement and recognizing that a person does not have the right to go to work. Comparing the early New York and Pennsylvania models, the Pennsylvania system developed classifications for inmates, and it was later abolished, but it was the first classification systems that we saw. Solitary confinement was the norm, again, with a focus on reforming the convict, and the determination was that they needed to be apart from society, apart from other convicts, and spent time alone and focusing on the Bible. Um, those later changes began to see those cells opened up and interaction allowed with other inmates, but the focus was still on spiritual reflection and reform. The New York system was the first to develop the congregate system, in which inmates ate and worked together but were still housed separately. It was also a very vicious system, as the thought related to deterrence was that crime prevention occurred through fear of punishment. And so corporal punishment was very prevalent during this time. Um, a lot of debates in the 1800s occurred over human rights and the treatment of prisoners, and predominantly New York and Pennsylvania were states that were involved heavily in those conversations. The concept of penal reform didn't just begin in the late 1800s. It lasted from about 1870 almost until the 1980s, just because of advancements in science and in technology, and a better recognition of how we treat prisoners impacts um, not only their lives, but how it also impacts our crime rates. But the first formal reform efforts began in 1870. The biggest impact of those efforts was the end of corporal punishment and the creation of prison industries and educational programs. So, in other words, instead of beating on prisoners, the focus was to put them back to work and to educate them so that when they got out of prison, they were better prepared to contribute to society than they were before. Um, Convict leasing was also a normal practice in which businesses or factories, especially at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, could lease prisoners for the day. The prisons made money on that. But that practice was ended with formally developed prison industries, and it was labor unions, oddly, who sided with them to help end that so that their members and their workers were able to access those jobs that prisoners were taking away. As you can probably imagine, prison labor or convict lease labor was very, very cheap labor. Parole was developed through this penal reform period, and that's purely an American invention. Now, that's not to say that it's not in use in other countries, but we're the country that developed the concept of parole, in which an inmate does what it is they've been asked to do during the time that they've been confined without any behavior problems and can display their ability to have rehabilitated themselves. They can usually be released earlier. The medical model um, was prevalently clung to in the 1960s and the 80s, and that dealt with more of the concept that prisoners are ill, um, or are victims of their own environment, and they need to be cared for and treated in order to understand the norms of society and move forward. Now let's take a look at some physical differences between different types of facilities. There are about 3,200 county jails within the United States that incarcerate about 738,000 inmates. Now, all of those jails are going to vary in age and they're going to vary in size. And between the smallest of the counties in the United States and the largest of the counties, sometimes there's multiple facilities. As an example, my jail was built in 1958. It still has bars and keys, and it can only hold 14 people. In contrast, the Johnson County jail system is actually 3 facilities and is designed to hold almost 1,000. Um, Jails detain, as we talked before, accused offenders pre-trial that can't post bond. They'll hold convicted offenders that are waiting on sentencing to the Department of Corrections. They'll hold probationers and parolees when they have to serve a sanction. And in some cases, it's limited, but in some cases, some jails will hold prison overflows if the Department of Corrections enters into a contract with them. The conditions of county jails has recently become a topic at the federal level simply because of their physical condition. And the fact of the matter is, county jails are a low spending priority. At the county level of government, public safety is paid for through property taxes. Um, the wages of law enforcement officers and dispatchers and jail staff are all paid from property taxes. And the cost to build a new facility is also borne to those same taxpayers through property taxes. So you can imagine the appetite of most citizens when they consider whether or not to build a new jail is very, very low because they don't want to pay the increased cost. Jails that have been built within the last 10 or 15 years have drastically changed the way that they're physically designed. As I mentioned, my jail is what's called a linear jail, in which it houses 4 distinct cells that can hold up to 4 inmates at a time, and it has a commons area. All of it is separated by doors, which are basically steel bars on hinges that we use keys for. It's not a safe environment to work in for staff because there are so many sharp corners that the ability to hide behind something to surprise a staff member is very prevalent. The new generation jails, though, have a focus on continuous or indirect observation. And direct observation requires that a pod or a cluster be built in which numerous inmates are held in a specific area. It's not squared out, it is usually curved in shape, and it allows an officer to sit in one point of the pod and see everything that's going on in there at any given time. Some jails that have been converted that maybe don't have that direct observation capability are supplemented through the use of technology. Microphones built into the walls or into the ceilings, or cameras around blind corners where an inmate may choose to hide. There's some research that suggested that new generation jails can reduce recidivism. That's not necessarily proven to be accurate. Our crime rates are somewhat on the decline, but at the same time, they're not at a rate that's indicative of the county jail or a new generation jail having an impact on that. There's no efforts to rehabilitate someone who's been incarcerated in a county jail, whether it's an old one like mine or a new generation jail. They're simply being held while they go through the court system. Very rarely are there any kind of services offered. I say that to bring up that the advent of offering rehabilitative services to inmates at the county level has recently come on within the last 5 or 6 years, mostly due to the opioid crisis. A concept known as medically assisted treatment services is being introduced to county jails that help people addicted to opioids break that habit through the controlled delivery of medication while they're being incarcerated. They're in a specific place, they're not going anywhere. There's staff there to help them manage when and how to take those medications to help them break that hold of that addiction. So it becomes a perfect place to do those things. But those programs, just like with many others, come with a cost that taxpayers have to be willing to support. Staffing levels in county jails are always an issue. It is a hostile environment that has a mundane and routine schedule. And that has a psychological impact not only on inmates, but it has a psychological impact on staff and corrections officers that work within that environment. And so if you visited with any sheriff in the state of Kansas, their greatest headache is the jail. Their second greatest headache is keeping that jail adequately staffed. So let's move on to prisons. Prisons are always classified based upon their capabilities, whether it be at the state or at the federal level. And so to a certain extent, these classifications that are displayed on your screen are appropriate at both levels of government. Almost every state will have a maximum security facility. It's designed to house dangerous felons, and there are strict security measures that are in place. Supermax facilities, on the other hand, are limited to the big states and to the federal government. Full incapacitation measures are employed at these types of facilities, in which inmates are housed 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. They are not allowed to interact with any other inmate, and they have zero contact with the outside world. You may see some prisons at the state level that have a supermax wing in a maximum security prison, and usually those are going to be death row inmates or the most dangerous of offenders, such as like BTK in the El Dorado prison. Medium security prisons are the most common. They house nonviolent offenders, and there is external contact that is permitted. These inmates are allowed to visit their family in person if they meet all the appropriate requirements. They are allowed sometimes to gain access to jobs, whether that be a prison industry or whether that be something on the outside, such as landscaping or any other kind of work they may be able to come up with. They are regularly and more aggressively screened than what we would see in any other type of facility, but they are allowed those other kind of contacts. Minimum security prisons are not as common anymore, but they still do exist. They are the least secure. These are designed to hold white collar and nonviolent convicts, and they also have an employment focus as well. Prison farms and camps are typically a product of the Southeast, and they are designed to provide rehabilitation through vocational training in the agriculture field. So these guys may go to work on farms, but the purpose of that is for them to learn agriculture so that when they leave the system, they're empowered to gain employment working on a private farm somewhere else. There's not too many boot camps that focus on shock incarceration anymore. Those those models began to fall away in the mid 2000s, but they were designed for juveniles and designed to aggressively counteract behavior before they became adults. In other words, to attempt to end criminal behavior well before someone would normally age out of crime and end up with a long-standing record. There was one here in Kansas that operated until about 2009, and then it wasn't financially feasible to keep that thing operating anymore. Community treatment facilities, I'm not aware of any that exist in our state, but they are growing in prevalence. This is going to be primarily for substance abuse offenders. It keeps the offenders in the community, and it provides them with residential programs and resources to allow them to seek treatment for their addictions, and they work to help them gain beneficial employment. Private prisons have existed for a long period of time, and predominantly they grew to popularity when prisons were being overpopulated, when the Supreme Court was leaning on both the federal government and some of the larger states to do something about their prison populations, and the states simply couldn't afford it. So major corporations such as CoreCivic came in, built big private facilities, paid staff at a rate higher than what the government actually could, and often set those things right beside public prisons. All that they really did, though, was provide short-term relief to the overpopulation issues. The federal government utilized them very heavily, and as concerns and criticisms related to the treatment of prisoners and the deplorable conditions within those facilities grew, while private profits were at an all-time high. These facilities began to go away. Interestingly enough, under the Biden administration, the use of private facilities by the federal government has been disallowed. And a conversation that I had been able to have the minute that rule came down with the U.S. Marshal for Kansas was his frustration, and it became his responsibility to find housing for these federal inmates that were sitting in these private facilities. It was quite the chore, and he had a very short window to get that done. So what do we look like today? Some researchers believe that the prison population is slowly beginning to decline. I'm not someone who believes that the data is clear enough yet to blatantly state that our prison populations are beginning to decline, but the trends that I do see as a boots on the ground guy are that less people are being sent to prison and more people are being diverted away to treatment programs, even out here in rural western Kansas. Now, I've got my own opinions on that I'll save that come from my perspective as the sheriff, but it certainly has an impact on prison populations that can't be ignored. Now, is that a long-term trend that's going to continue to protect society at the same time? That I'm not in a position to be able to answer appropriately because I don't think enough data exists yet to that. Population demographics, when we talk about prison populations, the demographics within the prisons are almost an 100% accurate reflection of the demographics within county jails. So it's still the same folks that we're still sending to the prisons. It just seems to be less of them. Though I'm a naysayer, there are states such as California, Florida, New York, North Carolina that are closing prisons because of their reduced populations, and they're taking the money that was used to maintain those systems and investing that into some of these other community-based alternatives. That is corrections at a very high level. Our next chapter, we're going to go in more in depth into prisons, specifically looking at prison life. Now, for this week, I've assigned 2 chapters to be read. I'm only requiring a discussion post for chapter 14. However, you need to make sure that you've read both of these chapters because the module quiz will contain questions from chapters 12, 13, and 14. So get with your reading. Make sure you take decent notes out of that, and have a good week.